Who do you think you are? Where did you come from? Before archaeology, most of us thought that the human race was around 4,000 years old. Many people believed it had begun when God placed Adam and Eve, fully formed, in the Garden of Eden. Archaeology's changed all this. It's given us 5 million years of brand new ancestors. It's transformed our idea of who we are and our relationship to all other life upon the planet. And it began with an ancient spark that lit the imagination of all of Europe. On the 24th of August, 79 AD, the volcano of Vesuvius in southern Italy blew itself to pieces, as it still does 2 or 3 times a century. In 79 AD, though, Vesuvius buried all the ancient cities around the Bay of Naples in shrouds of molten lava and hot, dry cinders. It took 16 centuries for that dark tragedy, in which 50,000 people died, to be brought into the light again. An exhumation that inspired the beginnings of archaeology. In 1736, a new king, Charles, came to rule in southern Italy and bought a small farm here on the Bay of Naples as part of his hunting estate. Now, this farm was famous for its well, in which many Roman statues had been found. So the king sent the royal antiquary, Count Marcello Venuti, down into the darkness to find out what was going on. You've got to think, what was in Venuti's mind at this point? He'd been lowered on a rope into a dark cave. He'd slithered down tens of steps that were dripping with water. He'd passed lots of strange ancient walls that were curving. Now, he'd been told it was a temple of Hercules, but to him, obviously, the curving seats reminded him of theatres. And then he turned up at this inscription. Now, this is remarkable. Venuti knows what he's looking at here. This is a dedication inscription to a monument. And it's got the name of the place of dedication, Herculanensis, the city of Herculaneum. He suddenly realises he's standing in a theatre, an ancient theatre buried under volcanic lava. Venuti informed His Majesty that a Roman city was buried beneath his hunting park. The king sent gangs of slaves back into the well shaft to cut its ancient treasures from the solid rock, and archaeology was born. In 1749, another gang of royal slaves was set to dig a canal through the soft fields of the plains below Vesuvius.
It was easy work, soft earth. About 20 foot down, though, they came across something very hard. It was a Roman road. When they cleared to the edges of it, there were rows of shops. The king's antiquary was called. He came down from Herculaneum, saw the street, and thought, my God, it's the same as we're cutting out of rock. And here is this lovely, soft, volcanic earth from the explosion of Vesuvius. So he got his gangs of workmen from the theatre and brought them down here.
What they didn't know as they started work was that under these fields was another buried city, the ancient city of Pompeii, caught fast in Vesuvius's ash and cinders. King Charles's men were opening time capsules, entire towns whose streets were scored by ancient chariot wheels and edged with shops and houses still filled with every implement of daily life. And temples too, and taverns and council chambers and public baths where friends had sat and talked amongst the steam. It was a beautiful and ancient world, just as it had been on the 24th of August 79 AD, and still part filled with the bones of its inhabitants. These buried cities set the imagination of the West on fire. Several of Europe's first popular novels wove their stories around the sad domestic dramas that the archaeologists were uncovering beside the Bay of Naples. This was Europe. This was Europe's own history. Every intelligent person in Europe had read Greek and Latin text. They knew this sort of ambience, but they'd never touched it, never seen it before. London was going nuts for Pompeii. The Adam brothers were putting Pompeian rooms in every large house in London. In Paris, Marie Antoinette had her apartments decorated like it. The influence of this place is so deep in the European bloodstream that you can't believe it all started here in this little provincial Roman town by the sea. It's a simple truth to say that archaeology began in Pompeii. One historian put it like this. He said that any excavation anywhere in the world, America, Russia, China, Australia, was simply a variation on a theme first begun here on the Bay of Naples. It's the idea that life itself, not just death and graves, but the same life that's in the living streets of people's homes, is also buried in the ground. Snapshots of history, moments of pleasure, of tragedy, of misery, sometimes sinister but always truthful, just waiting for the archaeologists to bring it all to life again. At Naples, King Charles made a great museum to show off the splendid treasures of the excavated past to visitors from the north. The noble products of the ancient Romans seemed part of the living world again, and the monarchy gained depth and grandeur from its newfound past. In Scandinavia, the lesson of Pompeii was quickly taken up. The idea that ancient life and history, and part of national identity as well, lay buried in the earth. Threatened by the armies of France and England and of Prussia, the Danish kings began to build an ancient past for their own embattled kingdom, a small collection of the antiquities of Denmark, taken from the legendary tombs and castles of its ancient heroes, those thousands of mysterious earthen mounds in which amateur historians had dug about for generations. Unlike Pompeii, though, these ancient mounds were utterly anonymous. Scandinavia had no written records before the coming of Christianity around 1,000 years ago. No ancient text to say who'd made these soft hills, or how old they were. The anonymous northern past seemed to hold no history in it whatsoever. This, though, was the so-called Danish Golden Age. In the early 1800s, embattled Copenhagen was a rich city with many artists, poets and antiquarians. One of these men, Christian Thomsen, a merchant banker's son, found a way to put the Danish past in order. A kindly man, a pioneering coin collector and lifelong bachelor, Thomsen also possessed the tenacity, the energy and supreme self-confidence of all successful 19th century businessmen. Appointed curator of the Royal Collection of Danish Antiquities, Thomsen invented a tool that would make history from the relics of the ageless past.
When Thomson took over the Danish National Archaeological Collections in 1816, what he really took over was a pile of junk. 600 bits. These are some of them. They're pretty enough, and in Thomson's day, nobody had a clue what most of them were, and certainly not how old they were. That I can tell you today that there is a span of 2,500 years of human history on this table is partly due to Thomson. He started it all. What he thought was that the most advanced materials would be used for tools and weapons, the cutting edge. And it all depended on what the cutting edge was made of. Some of the cutting edges were of iron. Quite a technically advanced process to make iron. That then he called the Iron Age, like this blooming great sword. There was bronze tools, like this beautiful spearhead. Mixture of copper and tin. They, he said, from the Bronze Age. Before that, less technologically advanced because it's a natural substance. This elegant stone spear came from the Stone Age. So let's start moving this stuff around. Cutting edges, what have we got? And this splendid stone axe must come from the Stone Age, along with that one too. This rusty old iron sickle must come from the Iron Age. And this beautiful little razor with its engravings from the Bronze Age. Now what are we left with? We've got a little pile of tat, stuff, very pretty, highly decorated stuff, but with no cutting edges on it. How do you decide where that comes from? Now this is his second great brainwave, and that is not to consider things in isolation, but to consider them as units of objects from the graves in which they came. This, for example, beautiful bronze piece of decoration had come from an Iron Age grave. That cloak pin too, the belt buckle, they were all of the Iron Age, though most of them were made of bronze. This great bronze torque, though, had been found in a grave with bronze weapons, so that was from the Bronze Age. What he's done, of course, by going stone, bronze and iron, is to make a sort of narrative out of material, real 19th century narrative of progress. He's made a history.
Thomson's system of the stone, the bronze and the Iron Age is still used by museum curators and by archaeologists. He'd made a sort of ruler, a relative history in time that seemed to give the Danish monuments and all these silent, enigmatic things the dimension of history. But was his history real? Was it true?
Thomson's 3H system was proved in excavations as early as the 1840s, often deep inside misty mounds like this one, the heart of ancient Denmark. The work was done by one of Thomson's assistants at the museum, a very precocious young man called Jens Jakob Vorso. He'd been excavating since the age of 15. And what he found and published scientifically from his excavations was the following: that always, when he found Bronze Age burials, that the Stone Age burials lay underneath and the Iron Age burials lay high above. Now this didn't just work deep inside the misty mounds, it worked in dozens of his excavations.
At last, these quiet mounds, these man-made hills the Danish kings had long admired, and sometimes turned into pretty memorials to their ancestors, had been put into a kind of history. Pretty soon, all northern archaeologists were describing their excavations in terms of the 3H system.
Finally, the academic bandwagon of scientific archaeology was on the road.
Musikkorps, march!
Vorso was exultant.
A nation, he said, could only respect itself when it knew its ancient history, when national character was revealed and people inspired to fight for national independence. Warsaw was made archaeologist royal. He was fitted out in a special military-style uniform and he was paid. He was the world's first professional archaeologist. By the 1860s, the learned Dr. Warsaw was excavating in the company of the king himself, accompanied by military bands. All the northern archaeologists needed now to turn their ordered, excavated past into real history was hard, fixed dates. The first of these came from a surprising place high in the Alps, from Hallstatt, Austria, a town so remote that in Warsaw's day it could only be reached by rowing across this alpine lake. Three and a half thousand years ago, though, this lonely town was a centre of international trade, a trade in salt, carried in little wooden boats. What drew the attentions of Scandinavian archaeologists to Hallstatt was not the salt trade, but a high mountain slope just outside the entrance to the ancient mines.
It's a funny story. There was an engineer called Ramshackle up at the mine. He needed some sand to make some concrete with. So he came out into these woods, started digging around just up there somewhere. When he dug, he found some bones. I wonder, thought Ramshackle, if this place was a cemetery of ancient miners. He was talking about it's the little old lady who kept her wood in that hut. And she said that just beside the hut, in her little kitchen garden, she dug up some bones too. There'd been some sort of bits of wonky jewellery and a poker, she said, which she showed him. Ramshackle saw it was a sword. So, Ramshackle and some of the miners came down here and they started to dig, and one by one they uncovered a series of graves. They were circular, they had like a clay bottom on them, a little round circle of clay. There was a body laying on them. Sometimes, though, they'd been cremated and the body was in a pot. But always there was the swords and the jewellery of the people in the grave. He and his small team, and a great draftsman who was working with him, dug up graves here for 25 years. They dug 1,000 of them up, and it astounded the archaeological world.
There was something else that was even more important here. What was interesting about Hallstatt was actually where it was in Europe. These people that mined salt were very rich. They didn't just have things that had been made inside their own culture, they imported them from other places. They had pottery from Greece, they had bronzes from Italy, they had amber from the Baltic, buckles and swords from Germany, and they all ended up in these graves, all in the same place, all at the same time. All of a sudden, you're touching the things of the north with the things of the south. The things of the north, you've got the 3-age system, but you haven't got any dates. The things from the south, well, the Greeks were reading, writing and making history books. They had dates. So suddenly, the abstract archaeology of the north touched the calendar archaeology of the south. And suddenly the north was given time and history. Despite the amazing discoveries of the northern archaeologists, the history they'd found only stretched back to the 7th century BC. The idea that there had ever been a Stone Age was still just a scientific theory, until proof of its antiquity was found in a truly unexpected place.
In the month of March, 1881, an Englishman, a certain Augustus Henry Plain Fox Pitt Rivers, took a cook's tour down the Nile to Thebes. He'd just come into a fortune.
As he trotted on his way to the Valley of the Kings that morning, something caught his eye, something he thought could help to solve an age-old archaeological problem. You see, ever since archaeologists had started work, they'd always assumed that man had a long past, that flints had been made thousands upon thousands of years ago, but they had no way of actually proving it. In the year that Picasso was born, in the year that the motor car was being invented, there wasn't a person on the planet who could actually prove to you that humankind was older than about 4,000 or 5,000 years. Now, Pitt Rivers, as an archaeologist, was particularly interested in proof. He said that an archaeological report should be able to stand up in a court of law. And what he'd seen on that road to Thebes was a way he thought of proving that the age of flint was older than the age of Pharaoh. That's the view Pitt Rivers had from his carriage. Not this modern village cemetery in front, but those older tombs behind. They're 4,000 years old, and in Pitt Rivers' day they already knew that. There were written ancient Egyptian records of tombs like this being inspected in this very cemetery. So there was a firm date for you. Now these tombs are rather unusual. They're not cut in the beautiful white limestone of Thebes, but in a loose gravel which has been washed down from the desert over many, many centuries. So Pitt Rivers then enlisted a geologist to help him with his work and to actually verify what he was doing, and went off to find some flints. The general found what he was looking for immediately, and it was this. See, in this natural wall of gravel, a man-made flint stuck very firmly. The wall was cut 4,000 years ago. The flint's in the wall. It hasn't been put in by man. The flint is older than the wall. The geologist called his servant in. The servant turned up with a hammer, banged all the flints out of the wall and sent them off to South Kensington as proof of what they'd found. Pitt Rivers then organised a survey of the entire cemetery for about half a mile, drew all the flints, made a beautiful drawings of the sections of the tombs showing all the changes in the stratigraphy here. A scientific article that actually proves, as if it was a court of law, that that flint is older than this tomb, that flints are older than pharaohs. Now look, let's not beat about the bush. For 1881, all sensible people already thought that flints were. That's not the point. It's the proof that matters. That's what archaeology is all about. It's not about spouting your head off about Atlantis or Orion's belt or any of that stuff. It's the slow, year by year, gathering up a picture of finding facts and proof in the hard earth. Pitt Rivers published his paper on the flints of Thebes, and it was very well received by archaeologists. But the old guard weren't nearly so impressed. The eminent Canadian geologist Sir J.W. Dawson claimed that all these flints were made by the actions of nature, by storms and floods and things like that, just by rocks bashing together. A group of French guys actually got a concrete mixer out, got a lot of flint, threw them in, churned it round, got the bits out and said, good Lord, look, these are just like the implements of early man. But they weren't, and Pitt Rivers knew they weren't, and he set out to prove it. What we're looking for here is what archaeologists call flint stations. That is, the sort of places where ancient people sat down and made flints, which they used as tools. That's a thing Pitt Rivers would have looked for when he was looking for proof of a man-made flint. You've got to remember, people that make flints are making them for a reason. They've got a shape in their head and they're trying to replicate it to make a tool out of a stone. So they're looking at the stone and they're finding the right place and they hit it like that. And when you hit flint, the energy of the strike goes in the flint and it bellows out. It's that strike that makes that beautiful soft round shape. It's called the bulb of percussion, and it comes from when you hit a piece of flint very precisely at one point. Bing, there, it's hit, and it makes this little bellow, rather like a stone going through a window, makes particular shapes in the glass, so that deliberate, careful strike always makes the same shape in the flint. Now, you could say that those stones going around in the cement mixer could have been produced in the same way. It's blooming unlikely, but it might have happened. So, Pitt Rivers had an answer for that too. He said, not only have you got this very deliberate point of striking, you've also got shaping. So, look at this little piece here. Here's a flint that's been struck very hard, and it has that beautiful round shape. And then the person who made this decided he'd make it into a little point. So he turned it over and he shaped it again there, and again along that edge there. He's made himself a perfectly symmetrical arrowhead. The chances of that coming out of a cement mixer are about as good as 6 monkeys at typewriters writing Shakespeare. That is Pitt Rivers' basic argument.
Back home in England, Pitt Rivers had taken possession of a vast estate, Cranbourne Chase, an archaeologist's dream, a landscape studded with the modest debris of 3 millennia of country life. People called Pitt Rivers the General. He'd been a professional soldier, run the army's gunnery school and fought in the Crimea. In that strange Victorian way, he was a hard and ruthless man, but curiously innocent too. One of the General's lifelong missions was to educate the masses. He was a follower of Darwin. To Pitt Rivers, the evolution of the human race and human society, of skulls and guns, of flints and feudalism, were all as one. He wished to scientifically prove that the order of the Victorian state was the natural outcome of evolution.
In 1885, Pitt Rivers was walking this part of his estate. He noticed a little molehill with something glittering in it.
Bent down and looked at it.
It was a piece of what he knew well was Samian ware. Now, Samian ware was Roman tableware.
It was only made in France and Italy. Quite a valuable type of pottery. So he decided to excavate this hill here. One of 50 major sites that he excavated, of course. He turned up, can't you see him going down the road there in a carriage with a driver with a top hat on, followed by 4 assistants wearing the General's livery on penny farthings, they said. They came here, of course, to the side of the hill. There were 10 labourers here digging this great circular trench out. This, it turned out, was the edge of an ancient village, you see. The men who dug this dug it for 6 months through the winter of 1886. They were paid 12p a day and worked 6 days a week, sun and shine. Anyway, what were they looking for? Well, the General was looking for a village. He wasn't after treasure. He had treasure, tons of treasure in his house already. What he was interested in is these little depressions, these little bunches of nettles that show you there's stone under the ground. And the men slowly worked their way through here, measuring everything. Every 6-inch discrepancy in the ground was noted and mapped. This is his monument he proudly put in the middle of it. It tells us, after he measured the skeletons, that the males were 5'1" to 3" and the women were a bit shorter. Here, it goes on about his favourite subject, which is skull shapes. The General was very fond of measuring skulls. And it tells you the sort of skulls. These are sort of pseudo-scientific terms for different shapes of skulls. Brachiocephalic skulls. 3 were mesaticephalic. 6 were dolichocephalic. And 3 were hyperdolichocephalic. One poor chap was uncertain.
In a series of beautiful painted mahogany models and the most splendid books, the General left an exact record of his 20 years of excavation on Cranbourne Chase, from the Bronze Age through the Roman period to medieval times. Though he found no treasure,
the science of archaeology came of age in these extraordinary publications. Here, the general developed standards of excellence, careful scientific methods that, as Pitt Rivers always said, would stand up in a court of law. Serving neither nationalism nor academia, privately printed and given away to friends and colleagues, these 4 great volumes, bound in the colours of the General's livery, now influence the work of archaeologists around the world. While Pitt Rivers was developing practical techniques of archaeology in England, another revolution was taking place in Europe. In a series of brilliant excavations in this remote French valley, an English banker, Henry Christie, and his friend Edouard Lartet, a retired French lawyer, pieced together the first coherent history of the distant human past. The lush valley of the River Vézère is a magic place. People have lived here in little rock shelters for hundreds of thousands of years, taking salmon from the river and deer from the woods. This was one of the first rock shelters that Lartet and Christie excavated. Not much of a place, you might think, but this little cave, the shelter of Le Moustier, now lends its name to types of ancient flints and individual Stone Age culture that was first found within it. Called the Mousterian, it's studied now by prehistorians and archaeologists around the world.
You see that big square cut up there? That's the back wall of a medieval house. You know, people have been living in these mysterious forests until quite recently. And underneath, an abri, a rock shelter. Nice place to dig, would think Mr. Lartet and Christie. And look, that's a wonderful archaeological section. That is a cut, a slice through the earth that runs in under the rock shelter. Look, this is what it looks like before you start to work. You see, it's just a regular old wood hill with leaves and stuff on it. This is literally what is under the ground. This is the sort of thing they were excavating. And it's the key to why this work is so incredibly important for the history of archaeology. These layers here represent different levels of habitation. There were people who lived here, and then later on the earth built up and the floor levels went up and up and up to leave these stripes in the earth. So when Lartet and Christie are digging down, they're going back into history. When they started to dig, of course, they were digging in here at the top, and of course they found medieval pottery from the house over there, right? Slowly, slowly as they went down, they went into layers where there were still bones, still flints, but no pots. They were into prehistory. Now these flints Lartet had seen before. When he got down to here, he found a beautiful floor line. You see, people who lived here lived on top of this great big band of silt that had been left from a flood. Nice, spongy place to live, a bit warmer than all the rubble. And there was a scattering of flints. He knew those flints, but he'd never seen them in a diagram of time before. So slowly they're working down. The flint patterns are changing till you get down to the bottom here, and they're quite primitive. This down here is absolute bedrock. These are very simple flints in here. It was a miracle, but to Lartet, it was a scheme of things. He could put the flints that had been found in Denmark and England all over this, similar flints. He had at last a scheme for history itself.
A history most educated Europeans assumed that was the complete history of the beginnings of all the human race. So scientific archaeology swept the board. And Adam and Eve were quite discredited. Along with this brand new scientific history, though, came a set of assumptions and beliefs that were shared by most of 19th century Europe. That chap there isn't Boris Karloff in Meet the Mummy. What he is a sculptor's reconstruction of what a pre-human person would have looked like based on some of the bones found here in the Vézère Valley. It's really a monument, you might say, to Lartet and to Christie and their successors. It's the image of our history, our prehistory, our most ancient history. It's a monument to all of that, but it's also a monument to the most colossal confusion. You see, Lartet and Christie were men of the 19th century. They believed in evolution, and they believed in savagery and primitiveness, and they believed that people alive in their own time were savage primitives, and they certainly believed that the people they were digging up here were. So when, just a few years after they finished their work here, the most beautiful paintings were found in caves and shelters a little way away from here in Spain, moving paintings, great works of art, everybody thought they were fake, because nobody could have ever imagined they'd been made by such barbarous primitives as this.
The paintings in the cave of Altamira on the north coast of Spain were found in 1879 by an amateur archaeologist, Don Marcelino de Sautuola. As he excavated at the entrance of the cave, his daughter Maria had wandered inside, looked up, and uttered, so legend says, the now famous words, "Papa, Papa, there are painted bulls." At first, the archaeological establishment did not believe that these images were painted in the Stone Age. It seemed to run against the theory of evolution. It was suggested that Don Marcelino had forged them. Then, similar paintings were found in France, in caves sealed since the Stone Age. So suddenly, Altamira became the Sistine Chapel of the Stone Age, and hunting humankind and art had all begun in Europe. And yet, within just a few decades, other Stone Age settlements were being excavated outside Europe and right around the world. In 1927, the British administration in Palestine decided to quarry rock from the biblical mountain of Carmel and sent a government archaeologist along to see if anything ancient was endangered. Digging in some shepherd's caves, he found Mysterian-style flints. And what was more sensational, the first piece of Stone Age art ever found outside of Europe. A broken sickle handle, carved, he reported, in the image of an animal which reminds one of the painted bison in the caves of Altamira. A year later, the great archaeologist Dorothy Garrod set up camp here and started excavation. That sickle, of course, implied reaping. Here then, in the Middle East, was the first evidence of the beginning of human agriculture, arguably the single most important event in human history, when the staples of our present daily diet were first developed. Right away, Garrod found ancient skeletons, their fragile bones set hard in ancient lime. Shipped to Europe, they were extracted centimetre by centimetre. At the time, they were the most complete remains of early humans ever found.
This is another one of the caves that Dorothy Garrod excavated on Mount Carmel. It's one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world. I think of it really almost as the cathedral of prehistory. The span is so extraordinary. Not only the span of Garrod's work in just 2 or 3 years, which was amazing for the time. The cave in Arabic is called El Taboon, the oven, because that great big swelling shape goes right up in the air like a chimney. Down that chimney from the plateau above, irregularly, came water with sand in it. And that sand buried layer after layer of human habitation. Give you an idea of the history. See that frame up there, that big white frame? See the bar that runs across the top? What is it? It's about an inch and a half thick. That has all of human written history in that. You have the pyramids. You have Jesus Christ, and you have us today. If you just come down a few inches to that line of Hebrew writing, there's the invention of agriculture.
Great thing is, Garrett didn't know the age. The most significant event in human history, she didn't have a clue of the period she was dealing with. When she got down where the letter C is, where those really amazing different coloured stripes are, they found a skeleton of a woman. It was of an earlier type of person than the skeletons round the corner, a sort of pre-human figure called a Neanderthal. But what surprised everybody was that that strata there was the same as the cave she had round the corner. Now, they were proper human beings round the corner, so it seems that Garrett had found two caves next to each other. In one of them, you've got pre-humans. In another lot, you've got humans. Well, were they talking to each other? Did they get on? Did they interbreed? Who knows? All that prehistorians like Garrett could say was that they were excavating unfathomable epochs of human prehistory. But there was still no known way of fixing dates. Had those two sets of skeletons from the caves really been precise contemporaries? How old were they? And when exactly had agriculture begun? The answers came from a most unexpected quarter.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
The first atomic bomb exploded in New Mexico at 5:30 on the morning of July the 16th, 1945. Along with many miseries, the mushroom cloud signalled a coming earthquake for archaeology. Continuing his researches into peacetime, one of the atom bomb scientists, Willard F. Libby, developed a technique to measure the tiny amounts of naturally occurring radioactivity in all organic materials. For archaeology, the significance of this was that the residual radioactivity of one particular subatomic particle, carbon-14, reduced at an absolutely constant rate from the moment of the organism's death. Libby had discovered a natural clock, a system of measuring absolute time century by century. The gift was revolutionary. Altamira, Libby said, had been painted 30,000 years ago, some 20,000 years before the first farmers of Carmel. And suddenly, to everyone's amazement, the pyramids of Egypt were no longer the oldest stone buildings in the world. Some of the chambers inside the misty mountains of northern Europe, Libby proved, were even older. At last, the archaeology of all of Europe was placed together on a single timeline, along with the archaeology of every other continent on Earth. Following this breakthrough, more time measuring systems were developed that pushed back the archaeological clock some 5 million years. Since the 1960s, these precious scientific dating methods have enabled archaeologists to build brand new histories of human origins. Most fundamental has been a shift of focus out from Europe and into Africa, and none of these African finds were more moving than Mary Leakey's discoveries at Laterly in Tanzania in 1976, dated, as are all such things today, by modern scientific method.
The track of footprints that you see here on my left was a truly remarkable find that we made this season. It's a trail left by 3 people who walked across a flat expanse of volcanic ash 3.5 million years ago.
Are these, then, the footprints of our most distant ancestors? And if they are, what can they tell archaeologists about the way we were?
This was a group of people walking together. One assumes they were perhaps holding hands, or they're so evenly spaced, the tracks, and they're keeping step, always left foot for left foot and right foot for right foot, that it may, for all we know, have been a family party.
Despite all the science of archaeology, we face the same old problems of interpretation. Are these the footprints of flesh-eating savages, or a gentle family group of vegetarians? How human were they? If you met them, would you take them home to dinner with you, or deliver them to a zoo? even at the most advanced excavations. Modern interpretations of the distant past still hold up a mirror to contemporary attitudes, just as they did a century ago, when archaeologists talked of primitives and savages. Today, in a technological age, most archaeologists describe human evolution as if it were software development or an engineering job, where we all start off as little furry animals, graduate to monkeys and early modern humans before driving off the end of the production line as Homo sapiens. What on earth, then, can archaeology ever really tell us about the way we were? Well, some of the simplest things, perhaps, and some of the most immediate.
You know, just a few miles away from here, archaeologists have dug up the world's oldest beach shelter. It's 500,000 years old, they tell us. Built not by human beings, but by hominids, pre-human species. These people weren't daft, though. They came to the beach every year in the early summer. They built this little hut out of branches about the same size as this place here. Bit of fire in the middle. And they built a wall outside to keep out the cold north wind. And they sat down to make some tools for hunting. They got the local limestone and they made great heavy choppers out of it. They got the local flint, made some nice little cutting tools. And then they went off and killed some of the rhinoceroses and the elephants that lived around here. They went up into the woods behind the beach and they killed themselves some deer. But judging by the rather touching little heaps of oyster shells and mussels that the archaeologists found, they also came down to the seashore, collected themselves some seafood. So these guys aren't daft, are they? I mean, these are the first Europeans we know of. They weren't in Droitwich or Manchester or Lubeck, they were in the Côte d'Azur, for God's sake. Add that animal pleasure to the sun, the sea, and all the rest of it, and you end up with a sort of humanity, a joie de vivre.
Notice how all our interpretations, past and present, start from facts, but are quickly seduced into assumptions about those areas of ancient experience that we really want to know about, but probably never will. Yet one thing's for sure about this archaeology. Whatever else it's done, it's given us back a past the Bible had long denied us. Archaeologists proved that we were not put upon the earth fully formed 4,000 years ago to use it as we wish. Archaeology has given us the broad outlines of a history that stretches back 5 million years and placed us once again as part of nature on the planet.